punk is just a rebellious rock for old?
We play for the people, you know, whereas they play for the money.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Glass Gecko. I'm your host, Glass Gecko. The first widely agreed upon defined punk band was the Ramones, formed in 1974 in New York. In 1965, however, musicians were already leading protests against the Vietnam War, and in 1968, Czechoslovakia used music to protest Soviet rule during the Prague Spring. This wave of anti-government, anti-war and anti-traditional music ran rife for years in the major music industries until finally, almost a decade after the rebellious youth came to be, punk was finally formed. I may not look it, but back in school I used to love punk. Really at that age I just blasted the Dead Kennedys and Minor Threat because I thought it was loud and it was cool. But then a punk band came along which made me question what punk really was. That band was Bad Religion. Then I got into Vietnam anthems, 60s music, and again, it made me question what the actual spirit of punk really was. Was it the sound or the message or the style? Throughout the years that's always been on my mind, but I suppose one thought that came to me rather recently is why America specifically was the country where this genre seemed to take off. The answer is actually a little bit different to what you may think, at least it was to me. So to understand it, we'll need to look at a few different avenues of thought. So today, I want to cover a few different sections. First off, what is punk? It seems pretty self-explanatory, but really, if we need to agree which country birthed punk, well, we need to know how to define the genre and its history. So why did people make it? Why was this new genre necessary to exist in the first place? And finally, why was it America specifically? Why not, say, Britain, where some of the most iconic early punk bands came from? Before we jump into our first section, I always have to go through this boring rigmarole, asking if you could please like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this sort of music culture and history content. I'm really uploading more regularly at this point, and well, any support is much appreciated. So, what exactly is this newfangled genre all the parents are frightened of? Punk is a label, it's a genre of music, but it's also a fashion sense, it's an attitude, an intellectual idea and a culture. Punk is a lot of things, but it also encapsulates a lot of different things, like rock or metal or emo. So where do we begin? Well, I'll begin at the end of the journey with the Ramones. You see, I think a good starting point for this video is the generally agreed upon musical construct of punk as a commercialised genre. So why is it that the Ramones were seen as the first punk band? Yet, you know, some other proto-punk bands, which we'll be mentioning later, were not. What was the actual decisive factor? Answering this will help untangle the rest of the video. From the 60s, there were many bands which had some heavy rockers and some very political lyricism, both governmentally and socially, but the key thing was they were inconsistent with this format. For example, it might be debatable whether the Beatles invented metal with Helter Skelter, but it would be pretty much impossible to classify them as a metal band because of it. You see, the key to creating a new genre is coming up with a new template which is followed consistently. This is essentially what the Ramones did. There were plenty of bands which you can argue had more punk sounding songs before the Ramones, but due to them not fitting into a consistent template, it's hard to define them as actual punk bands. Now, this may seem like a bit of a cop-out because to some people this really isn't a true definition at all, but let's be honest, when it comes to music and the industry, it's very hard to understand where things start and end outside of what the commercial label decides. It really doesn't matter how punk you think your favourite punk band is, their label and category is still decided by the man at the top holding the wad of cash. It's him who controls what's approved on advertising and what isn't. And it's his definition which really matters. This, unfortunately, is also true for fame. Again, especially when looking at punk, it may seem unfair, but we can only really outline a band that had a significant effect as the genesis. Yes, there was probably some small group in Italy or somewhere, but unfortunately your fame is in of itself intrinsic to being a pioneer. We can debate this point if you want, but for the video this is really the way of thinking that I'll be sticking with. The Ramones, with their debut album Ramones, released in 1976, adhered consistently to the template of extremely short songs, extremely simple chord progressions, relentless speed and full sound. This, along with simple to understand, sloganistic lyrics and their new leather jackets, ignoring the greases of course, which helped also define the culture. On top of the music, once the Ramones hit the scene, much of the Western world seemed to latch on. As well as notable other countries, it seemed England would be greatly affected, as to create some of the most iconic, defining groups in punk's formative years. Even by the turn of the decade, despite America inventing punk, England had transformed it into a counter-political culture. I'm not just trying to glorify English punk for no reason, by the way. This viewpoint will be relevant a little later in the video. It's not just this, but within this template there needed to be a complete rejection of the already established rock industry. This will really be the topic of the next section, but this is very important to mention. The consistent structure is key, but within that structure there needed to exist a complete rejection of the existing rock culture at the time. So this briefly sums up the origin of rock and punk as a defined, recognisable genre. We'll get back to this shortly, but what about punk as a sound? Punk has always been seen as a very raucous sound with crass lyrics, pardon the pun, but how about a man and his guitar singing about how he doesn't want to kill or die? I mean, look at him. He's not wearing a leather jacket, he's not striking power chords or screaming down the mic, but I'll still wager his sincere message is more punk than a lot of punk bands today. You see, this is sort of the problem with trying to define things with commercial standards, because the idea of punk is so broad, you could really pluck out pieces of classical music and cite them to be anti-authoritarian, or the most bubblegum pieces of modern pop to be challenging of social norms. But, you know, if we get too abstract, this video essentially becomes pointless, so let's just rein it in a little bit. If we look at folk and blues, to begin with, these grassroots genres have always been very poignant about their messages of societal culture and emotion. From early in the 20th century, folk musicians have not been shy singing about the wrongdoings of the government and its treatment of the population, nor has it tried to avoid important social issues. This is arguably the oldest form of punk as an idea, which is really relevant to look at. But I think we can all agree that folk exists so far out of what we understand to be punk culture, outside of the base message of the songs themselves, there's almost nothing to cement them as punk. But the ideas of these early folk artists were very important in shifting the musical Overton window, if that terminology works, into punk existing later on. Later blues and rock and roll, well, they're relatively similar in this regard. Again, there are messages of social and political commentary, many times at the expense of authority and normality, and despite these genres having a more heavy sound than folk, it's again hard to see them as punk by definition. They did not adhere to the structure or formula, despite some songs here and there being very controversial. They were also highly commercialised, not shy about profit incentives and lavish lifestyles, which, well, that's not very punk if you ask me. Rock especially got bogged down in an over-commercial, stagnant industry, which will be very, very relevant for our next section of the video. Now, hard rock and roots rock was developing through the 60s and 70s, despite bands like CCR being global anthems of anti-war and anti-government messaging. These bands did not adhere to a template that separated them enough from earlier rock bands. They were pretty much the same in spirit and sound as previous pop and rock and roll bands, just with some more controversial lyricism. You could argue that the movement these bands created was pretty punk, but again, this becomes so nuanced, we're going to get sidetracked into a 20-minute tangent on how hippies and punks are really barely different at all. Metal music also came about before punk. This is really due to metal answering a different problem though. As I say before, punk existed to completely and intentionally reject the existing tools of the rock scene. Metal wasn't born to reject rock, but to expand its sound. Due to technological advances, much like with experimental music, new recording equipment and electronics allowed for more distorted and heavy sounds. Metal may be an angry genre, much like punk, but the intention behind the genre is completely separate to the intention of punk's origins. Metal still relied on virtuoso musicianship and big sell-out arena tours. Punk rejected this entirely, at least in the beginning. This brings us to proto-punk and garage rock. These genres are likely the most logical predecessors to punk and really the most relevant to mention. Now, of course, proto-punk is by nature quite experimental and very broad. Many huge bands dip their toes into its sound. It's in these genres we see a direct influence of the Ramones and punk bands. Bands like the Stooges and the New York Dolls. They're really cited by many to really be the first punk bands by definition. As I've outlined earlier, it disagrees with my definition, but in an abstract sense, it's undeniable the origins of what we accept as punk culture existed in these scenes. Raw sounds and short songs laid the groundwork for the Ramones to exist, and that was the subculture in New York which allowed punk to take flight. So, punk can be seen as an extremely broad idea, and it's really up to the individual's opinion as to what defines it. People might say this is punk, people might say that's not punk, but if we go about things logically, we really need to agree on something, and it's the idea of this standardised template of punk, born out of the reasons I'm going to get into, which I think we'll really make the most progress with. So, now we know what a punk band is, well, why exactly did they come about? Like many, I thought that the reason for punk's existence was really purely political. Turns out this is punk through a British lens, and is something I'll touch on later. As I said before, bands like CCR and the Rolling Stones and such, they'd already made songs criticising governments and their actions. So it's not like punk bands singing about politics was that defining of a thing, but it depends which politics we're talking about, and what really birthed punk was the politics of the music industry itself. You see, by the mid-70s, rock was getting old. Experimental music had essentially crept into pretentious territory. The biggest artists in rock were dragging out 10-minute guitar solos over their innovative concept albums. Metal had now hit the scene, but metal was fundamentally very different in nature to the rest of conventional music. It also didn't reject the existing rock framework, as I talked about before. As crazy as it may seem to us now, the Beatles singing Happily Along to She Loves You back in 1963 was seen as very rebellious. This was because of the haircuts and the accents and the electronic sound. Of course now many would look at 1963 McCartney and be baffled as to how parents at the time were comparing him to Satan himself, but that's how it was. They marked a distinct change in the industry, and the youth which was yearning for something new and rebellious, well, they latched on. Modern music from that point began to develop, experimental music took off and different genres were beginning to form. But rock as a mass commercial industry in America needed a rebirth. So punk didn't actually form through Vietnam War protest or South American intervention or anything like that. It's primarily because the youth of America were extremely fed up with how long and drawn out commercial rock had become. They were sick of the pretentious sounding virtuoso guitar solos. They were sick of yet another arena tour and its glitz and glam. The youth deliberately threw it all back in the face of the industry. They purposefully created short, unpolished songs with no added superficial BS. This transition could really only happen once rock had become fully institutionalised. It was America where this really happened first, and thus, with no other options, it was America where the youth created punk as we know it. So, why was this not the case in Britain, or Europe, or anywhere else for that matter? Well, depending on how politically turned on you might be, you may notice that the commercial aspects of music and how the media promotes it is different in many countries. This is coupled with America's incredibly vast economic wealth, which was clearly prevalent in the early 20th century and ever since. The literal geographic size of America also meant large-scale touring was more accessible, not to mention that America was a musical pioneer in many other instances. I mean, they created rock and roll as well as FM radio. It's no surprise that more innovation would follow. More so than other countries, America had really perfected the art of packaging artists into a tight commercialised bundle, mainly for the profit of the record labels and media. America, its people and its labels, they had a lot of money to spend, and although talent may have come from all around the world, it was America where the money was to be made. This is of course why the British invasion is one of the most defining moments in music history. From the 50s, once America had learnt the profitability of music, they streamlined the art of signings, promotions and record labels into a replicated template. This was also done on a national scale. Unlike in England in the early 60s, where a lot of connections were made locally and record deals were usually signed with local labels or individuals, America had a steady supply of large labels willing to platform a wide array of artists. Of course, local deals were prevalent in America as well, but it was more available in America to be picked up and platformed for major profit incentive, especially if you started to gain any traction in sales. But why does this matter? Well, because at some point the art of making music becomes, in the eyes of the labels, the same as the art of making money. Due to the culture of the 60s, experimental ideas and rebellious rock and roll after World War II meant it was actually profitable to be groundbreaking. But, as for any art, this really can't last forever. Once a formula is created and the labels understand this, it's much more logical from a business standpoint to play it safe and promote bands which make the same sound as what we already know to be successful. This stagnates the culture and leads to less innovative music making. Once the 60s heyday was said and done, a lot of what was left was groups of old bands trying to cling on to their glorious past and split off genres which had been created in the aftermath. But for the mainstream, that lack of creative incentive had proved pretty damning for many artists and people. This general idea is what contributed to music becoming stale in the eyes of the soon-to-be punks. It didn't actually matter if bands like CCR were slandering the government. It didn't actually matter if the hippies were preaching peace and love. It did nothing to change the fact that music, for the most part, was still stuck in the mid-60s, and no amount of superficial experimentation was going to change that. The American media and government were also really quite smart. They allowed and normalised the counterculture in order for the movement to become mainstream. I covered in a previous video about anti-war songs, but the US strategy of neutralising and repackaging rebellious music in order to remove the threat was executed very, very well. Punk was necessary as the existing rebellions at the time really had the green light from the people that they were trying to critique in the first place. By the way, this point was actually brought up to me later in the comment section to that video, so, thank you guys for educating me on topics that I talk about as well. Now, perhaps I'm oversimplifying things and making the situation seem worse than it is. Of course, if you're a fan of this era of music, you'll know there was no shortage of great, innovative and fresh sounds to come out of that era. But what I'm more alluding to is the need for a complete change and rejection of the status quo in the minds of the youth at the time. I'm certainly not saying that once the late 60s hit, rock music just died and there was no great artist popping up. That's certainly not what I'm saying, but what we need to look at is the general trend. Of course there were standouts, but as an overall genre, it had become stale and extremely institutionalised. It had become almost exclusionary in many ways. It had become elite and lavish, and it was a long shot from its rebellious roots in the 50s. Now this is really the American tale, but do not be deceived. You may think, oh, would you look at that? American greed and capitalism killed music. What a surprise. The only reason no other country achieved this is really because no other country had the financial ability nor wide-scale success to do so. Well, that, or the people didn't have any freedom of expression to critique the governments they were in. So many great artists, for example, came from England because, well, they needed to be creative in that environment. They desperately needed something to stand out, as the chances of major success were far, far slimmer. America had essentially suffered from success in an economic sense. Most other countries would have operated the same way had they had the means to do so. For example, in Britain itself, despite not having the economic potential of America, the industry became very centralised and controlled by the late 60s. This is one of the reasons why punk wasn't born in Britain in the first place. There wasn't enough opportunity for an organic subculture to succeed. Okay, so what about the social scene? Well, America was in a war with Vietnam which millions opposed. People were on the streets every week waving their banners. I mean, of course punk was going to come from that, right? Well, no. Punk began as a much more individual and artistic choice. In America, places like Detroit had collapsed economically in terms of standards of living completely, but New York proved to reverse people's misfortunes. At the time, I know it's hard to believe now, but rent was relatively cheap. There was a massive underground culture and a collection of all the weird social outcasts and artists and college dropouts found a home in New York. New York had much more opportunity than any other city around the world in terms of failing bands as well. Let me explain. It's not like before the Ramones, no one had even attempted punk, and then after the Ramones, punk just randomly hit the scene. There needed to be an environment where experiments could be tried and failed. Artists needed a space to walk so their successors could run. In London, the only experimentation that would get you anywhere was the run-of-the-mill, tried and tested experimental music, or even dreaded glam rock, which we're not going to talk about. You see, New York allowed the American culture of raw garage bands to experiment, and the mixture of artists and college dropouts all listening together eventually allowed the genre to break out. It's in these cities that proto-punk had already begun to take off as a rebellion to how mainstream rock had become, and an environment thrived in which would eventually lead to the full-blown punk scene. You see, punk's political image, and later extremely political punk bands, would get their idea from Britain's punk scene. Despite Britain not being involved in any major conflict, the class divide and worsening social landscape had led to punk being used as a tool of expression concerning class division, usually happily and openly targeting certain people and their ideas. However, in America, punk's politics started off technically unified. Essentially, it was the unity of disunity. There was no unified political belief in a left or right sense, as we see politics today. Punk was born to fight for the idea that raw simplicity was all that rock needed to be. This allowed a unified subculture to rise up and agree on a base idea before splitting off afterwards into their specific niches and sounds. This was the culture that created the Ramones, and this was the culture that allowed that scene and that template to be fully realised. If we look outside of the Western sphere, developing and newly independent nations around the world had their problems too. As I say before, you'd think a high level of social and political instability would birth punk, and there were plenty of nations which were going through cataclysmic levels of instability outside of America. But here we need to understand the difference between global and regional music culture, and why that really matters by definition. I covered before a video concerning the Soviet Union and how rock and roll was used to combat Soviet rule. And even before the Ramones, we have Czech and Polish and East Berlin proto-punk bands being formed. But the reason I'm hesitant to crown them as such is due to the reasons I cited earlier for my definition of a punk genesis, which must include tangible fame and recognised influence, which began a large-scale movement. Technically these bands may have been punk, but it's rather arbitrary, as situations like that had cropped up in many places. If we're keeping things tidy, we need to accept that where the global influence came from is where the recognised genre began. Not to mention that a lot of countries were highly censored and some cultures just didn't celebrate this music. You really think the Chinese, for example, would have been able to develop a national and later global punk movement under Mao Zedong? America allowed for political discourse to be sung about and broadcast. It allowed opportunity for the youth to go out and buy a guitar and write songs about whatever they wanted and reap the rewards. To a degree, of course. Ironically, for a country to invent the most rebellious genre of music, well, the country had to be free enough to platform it in the first place. As this comment in one of my previous videos says, America wasn't allowed by law to censor art or music. America was free. Say what you want, but compared to the rest of the world, it was free. And its freedom allowed its people to create punk. From then on, punk has always been a prevalent genre in music. It has been moulded into different fashions and has taken up new sounds. It's morphed and adapted as the decades have gone by. It's spread subcultures all over the globe. But for the reasons as stated through the video, I hope I answered the question, why was punk born in America? I've been Glass Gecko, and thank you so much for watching.